Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what I think is one of the most interesting assessments we've heard about the Russian economy for quite some time, because over the past 4.5 years, we've heard plenty of warnings from Western economists, Western governments and analysts suggesting that sanctions, the cost of the war in Ukraine and Russia's increasing isolation will eventually lead to major economic problems, and we're seeing the evidence of that. And obviously the Russian government has consistently pushed back against that narrative. But this time the warning isn't coming from Washington, London, Brussels or Kiev. It's coming from somewhere right inside the Russian financial establishment. Andrei Klepach, the chief economist at VEB, Russia's state-owned development bank, he's also a former deputy minister of economic development. So this is someone who spent many years operating at a very senior level within Russia's economic system, and his assessment is remarkably blunt. Klepach says Russia is falling behind economically and technologically. He says Russia cannot win a prolonged war of attrition against Ukraine and its Western supporters, and perhaps most strikingly of all, he's warned that Russia could ultimately face what he describes as a social crisis. Now that is an extraordinary assessment coming from somebody in his position. Now before we go any further and talk about this story, if you haven't subscribed yet, could you please hit that subscribe button? Also, if you could give me a thumbs up for this video, and if possible, if you can see that hype button, if you could press it, because that will then push this video to more people on the algorithm, and that will all put a massive smile on my face. Now I think it's important to understand exactly who Andrei Klepach is, because this isn't somebody standing outside of Russia throwing stones at Vladimir Putin. Klepach has worked at the heart of the Russian economic system for all of his life. He previously served as deputy economic minister, and today he's chief economist at VEB, which is effectively Russia's state development corporation. One former Putin speechwriter has even claimed when he worked inside the Russian government, he regularly witnessed Vladimir Putin paying close attention to Klepach's economic assessments. So when somebody like this starts talking publicly about major structural problems in Russia, it's worth listening. And Klepach's central argument essentially is that Russia is becoming trapped in a competition that it cannot win indefinitely. For the first couple of years following the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian economy performed better than many people expected. The government poured enormous amounts of money into the defence sector. Factories increased production, workers were needed in military industries, wages therefore increased as companies competed for a limited pool of labour, government spending supported demand, and statistically that produced some very impressive GDP growth. Russia's economy expanded by almost 5% in 2024, but that growth fell to around 1% last year. And the Russian government's current forecast for 2026 has recently been reduced to 0.4%. So we're talking about a very significant slowdown from those initial years of wartime expansion. But there has been some better news recently for Russia. Russia's GDP increased by around 1.3% year on year during the second quarter of 2026, after contracting during the first quarter. That meant the economy has grown by roughly 0.6% across the first half of this year. Consumer spending, wholesale trade, freight transportation and parts of manufacturing have all helped to produce that improvement. So I don't think it's accurate to say that Russia is currently collapsing right now. But that's precisely why Klepach's warning is so interesting at this point. He's effectively arguing that headline GDP numbers don't tell you everything about the long-term health of the economy in Russia. The question is what Russia has to do in order to produce that growth that it's producing. Huge amounts of state spending have been directed towards defence. Resources have been diverted from civilian parts of the economy. Workers have been pulled into military production, and that's contributed to labour shortages, wage pressure and inflation. At the same time, civilian businesses have been dealing with extraordinarily expensive borrowing costs. Russia's central bank recently reduced its key interest rate to 14%. But if you just take a step back and think about that, forget about the reduction in the interest rate. Let's just focus on the actual interest rate of 14%. That is still an extremely high cost of money for anybody trying to borrow, invest, or expand a normal commercial business. And despite keeping rates at those levels, annual inflation is running at 6%, which is 50% higher than the central bank's 4% target. Russian business leaders themselves have been complaining about this for a long time. Earlier this year, some of Russia's richest businessmen publicly argued that high interest rates had effectively created a trap for the Russian economy. Steel billionaire Alexei Mordashov talked about a major fall in steel demand and declining investment. And German Gref, chief executive of Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, reportedly described achieving even minimal growth in the current environment as something close to a miracle. Again, these aren't Western commentators. These are people running some of Russia's biggest businesses and financial institutions. And we're also seeing signs of weakness underneath the headline GDP figures. Russia's service sector activity contracted for 4 consecutive months in the period through to June. New business declined at its fastest rate since December 2022. Service companies are cutting jobs, and firms have reported that customers are struggling with reduced purchasing power and financial pressures. Manufacturing has subsequently shown some improvement, which is a minor positive, but export orders have remained very weak. So we're increasingly looking at a very uneven economy. And then you've got another major problem. The Russian government is spending enormous amounts of money. During the first half of 2026, the federal budget deficit reached 5.7 trillion rubles. So basically Russia has spent 5.7 million more than it's earned. That's around 2.5% of GDP in the first 6 months. And current projections suggest the full year deficit could exceed the government's original plans by more than 1 trillion rubles as expenditure continues to rise. That's important because every additional ruble of government spending supports demand. But if the economy doesn't have enough spare workers, factories, and productive capacity to meet that demand, the result can simply be more inflation, which then puts pressure on the central bank to keep interest rates higher for longer, and that puts even more pressure on ordinary civilian businesses. So you start to see the vicious circle that Russia has created for itself. Russia, of course, still has one enormous advantage. It's got a lot of energy products, and the massive increase in global oil prices connected with the war in Iran has given Moscow an unexpected financial boost. It's able to actually sell some of its products. Russian oil and gas revenues are expected to jump in July compared with 2025, but there's another important detail buried underneath the figures. Across the first 7 months of 2026, oil and gas revenues are expected to be lower than they were this time last year. And last year's annual oil and gas revenue had already fallen to its lowest level since 2020. So higher global oil prices are undoubtedly going to help Moscow, but they don't magically eliminate all of the other structural problems, particularly when you take into account the fact that Russia's refining business is on its knees as a result of the drone attacks that Ukraine is launching. So Russia is able to sell crude oil, the basic raw material, at slightly higher prices than it would have done without the war in Iran happening. However, the most valuable part of its exports, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, all of those really high margin products, Russia has banned the export at the moment because it simply doesn't have enough to actually service its own demand, because the refineries are constantly having to shut down every time an attack takes place. So once again, the headline figures might look good, but when you dig into the detail, Russia is in real difficulty right now. And this brings us back to Klepach, because one of the things he specifically highlighted is the increasing impact of Ukraine's attacks on Russia's economic infrastructure. We're talking about attacks on refineries, ports, chemical plants, logistics infrastructure, and other critical facilities. And that's important because the economic impact doesn't finish when the fire is extinguished. If a refinery goes offline, somebody has to repair it. production is lost, fuel supplies become tighter, transportation therefore becomes more expensive in Russia, insurance costs also increase, companies have to find alternative supply routes, and all of those additional costs ripple through the whole economy. We've recently seen exactly that with Russian trucking companies. Fuel shortages and rising prices have pushed transport costs higher, while freight rates on some routes have increased dramatically. And once transportation costs rise, ultimately somebody has to pay for it, and that somebody is always the consumer. The Russian central bank itself has acknowledged these inflationary risks, and Russian business sentiment has deteriorated significantly. The central bank's business climate indicator dropped into negative territory in July and reached its weakest level since the middle of 2022, which was when the Ukraine war started. One Russian economist described the danger of stagflation as being very high. That's essentially one of the worst combinations you can have in an economy: weak or stagnant growth combined with rising prices. Because if the central bank cuts interest rates aggressively to stimulate growth, inflation can then accelerate. But if it keeps rates high to control inflation, it risks putting even more pressure on businesses and investment. You're effectively choosing which problem you want to tackle first. And this is why Klepach's comments about Ukraine are particularly interesting. There's been an assumption in some Russian circles that eventually Ukraine's economy will simply run out of money and collapse. Klepach doesn't believe that's going to happen. He acknowledges that Ukraine has suffered enormous destruction and demographic damage, but he points out that Ukrainian economy continues functioning, partly because it receives enormous financial assistance from Western countries. In other words, Russia isn't simply competing economically against Ukraine. If it was, it would have won the war by now. But it's competing against Ukraine plus a very large network of countries capable of providing money, weapons, technology, and economic support. And Klepach's conclusion is extremely straightforward. Russia cannot assume that its opponent will collapse first. But perhaps most extraordinary part of his comments concerns what could happen inside Russia itself. Klepach reportedly compared the current situation with major turning points in Russian history, including 1917 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, he's not predicting that Russia itself is going to collapse. In fact, he specifically said that he doesn't believe that will happen, but he does believe that the country could reach what he describes as a social crisis. And his point is that social crises don't necessarily arrive neatly according to an economic timetable. Things can appear relatively stable for a long period, and then suddenly confidence changes. Public attitudes change, political attitudes also alter. Something happens that acts as a catalyst to speed up all of this. And a situation that looked sustainable suddenly doesn't quite look as sustainable anymore. Now, I think we need to be careful that Russia isn't about to experience a revolution. That's not what he's saying. But what we are talking about in today's video is that a major warning is coming from one of the most senior Russian bankers. And we're seeing this now on a regular basis. Russian businessmen, Russian economists, and senior state people are saying that Russia is losing ground technologically and that the economic damage of the war is mounting, and Russia is now facing serious social problems. And I think that tells us something very important. The question facing Russia may no longer simply be whether it can afford to continue fighting the war today. Obviously, it can keep funding all of those missiles. The much bigger question is what continuing the war does to the Russian economy for another year, 2 years, 3 years, or who knows how long, because military expenditure can technically support GDP. It looks good on paper. It can keep factories operating if they're supplying things for the war effort. It can create jobs in those factories. But producing a missile that is subsequently fired and destroyed doesn't increase the country's long-term productive capacity. It doesn't build a new commercial aircraft, for example. It doesn't modernize civilian infrastructure. It doesn't create a new technology company. It doesn't improve education, and it doesn't create more productivity. That's the fundamental economic problem with prolonged wartime growth. You can generate enormous amounts of economic activity while simultaneously diverting resources away from things that determine how competitive your economy will be 10 years from now. And that appears to be the warning from Andrei Klepach. Russia may be capable of sustaining the war for considerably longer, but sustaining something and ultimately winning the economic competition are two very different things. And when that warning comes from someone sitting inside Russia's own state financial system, rather than from someone outside the country predicting its imminent collapse, I think it's considerably more interesting. So I wanted to share that with you. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you have the option and you can see that hype symbol just alongside the thumbs up, please hit that because it will help this video. Thank you so much for supporting me. I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you've bought me a coffee, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. If you've sent me a YouTube super thanks, that is also fantastic. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, I really appreciate that long-term support. That's the thing that really keeps me motivated and making as many videos as I can. So thank you so much for all of that, and I will see you again next time.